Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion today. The title of our panel is Navigating Apprenticeship, Understanding the Legal Rights and Responsibilities in Work-Based Learning. My name is Tamika Shelton, and I'll be guiding you through today's event. Before we begin our panel discussion, we would like to start with giving you an overview of the MAPS apprenticeship program. And today we have two representatives from MAPS, Danica Lopez and Annika Bennett, who will share some insights on the MAPS apprenticeship program. If you ladies would like to
Yeah,
come on.
absolutely.
Sure.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annika Bennett, and I am the Director of Academic Design and Employee Engagement for the MAPS program. We're really excited that we're here with you today and able to host this webinar on legal rights and responsibilities in work-based learning because we've received actually a lot of requests to talk about this topic. So for anyone on this webinar who's not familiar with the MAPS program, my colleague Danica and I will do just a very brief overview. MAPS stands for Modern Apprenticeship Pathways to Success. It's a Department of Labor grant project that seeks to develop and expand work-based learning experiences with a special focus on apprenticeship programs. It's a very collaborative workforce development initiative as we work with lots of people, including employers and community-based organizations, and of course, our partners within the local community and community college system, KCTCS, to build strong talent pipelines in healthcare, advanced manufacturing, and also IT. So we are right now in our fifth and final year. We started in 2020, and we've done a lot over the last really 5 years now. And so far we've welcomed and enrolled over 4,000 participants, which is really great to see the impact that we have intentionally supporting women, underrepresented minorities, and also our military connected individuals and families.
With that, what we do is we build two strands of apprenticeships. We have our academic apprenticeships that utilizes the University of Louisville's curriculum to put together work-based learning opportunities in the form of apprenticeships for our students here at the university. And we also have community-based apprenticeships where we work specifically with organizations who may or may not have ties to the university and who may or may not utilize the university's curriculum in order to build out apprenticeships specifically for their incumbent workers and to assist with their retention efforts within their organization.
Okay, thank you, ladies, for that insight of the MAPS apprenticeship program. So let's get into it. Let's dive into today's topic. I first want to begin by introducing our esteemed panelists, who will guide us through the various legal rights and responsibilities of apprenticeships. So first we have Jacob Purcell, Esquire. He's a partner at Manley Burke. He practices corporate law, employment law, real estate, dispute resolution, nonprofit, and not-for-profit organizations. Very busy. Jacob is a graduate of Miami University and the University of Pennsylvania. He has been recognized as a rising star by the Super Lawyers for 23, 24, and 2025. And he's also he got the Leading Lawyer Award from Cincy Magazine in 24. Then we have Dr. Micah E. Kamras, practicing higher education law, real estate law, election and campaign finance law. So he will be busy this year. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt University and the Ohio State University. He was also voted a rising star by Super Lawyers and one to watch by Best Lawyers of 2025. If you guys will pop on camera, and so we can introduce you and we'll get started. So they can see you and we'll get started.
Thank you. We're really excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for showing up and sharing your insights. So if you guys are ready, I'll dive in. For the audience, we did kind of break this into three topic sections. So we'll start of what apprenticeship is. So if one of you guys want to jump in and just basically what the difference is between like an apprenticeship, an internship, work-based learning.
You know, in the world of employment law, at least from a legal perspective, the way that I view apprenticeships is employment law plus. So whereas an internship is more kind of general, broad-based, you can kind of take those skills and apply it anywhere. It's usually for a shorter duration in time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be learning exactly the thing that you would be doing in that ultimate career path. Apprenticeship is much more specific. It is much more regimented. Obviously, as we will get into today, there's a higher regulatory component and things that you must follow. But the idea of apprenticeships has been around for an incredibly long time, right? Since blacksmiths and even legal professions used to work through apprenticeships. And the idea was that this was kind of an alternative to the traditional college-based path, and it's something that, not every single job would have an apprenticeship eligibility, but it's something that's more skills-based, something that takes a long time to learn, something that, frankly, if you put yourself in kind of the client or the consumer perspective, hey, I really want that person to have on-the-job training. I want to know that they've done this multiple times. And because usually what they're working on is really important. We're talking about carpenters, electricians. We talked about IT, healthcare. These are things that you really can only truly learn by doing. It requires digging into the books, it requires taking classes, and it requires that kind of higher type knowledge and education. But you fundamentally will not be able to do that job without learning from somebody who does it. And that's the idea of an apprenticeship. They're longer in duration than an internship. The on-the-job training component is significantly more of your time and effort than the kind of books and training component of it. And the idea there is to give you the practical skills that are necessary to be able to do that occupation.
The flip of what Jake was discussing with apprenticeships, kind of for co-ops, internships, the not employment law plus, like Jake was discussing, of apprenticeships. There is a lot less regulation in the kind of like internship and co-op space, and some of it has to do with agreements between education institutions and employers and whether or not credit is given for toward like a graduation degree. But the employment law is set up in a way for internships where our courts have I think a 7-part test to determine who is the primary beneficiary in an internship. Is it the employer or the intern? And that helps determine whether that person under FLSA is an employee or not. And that's when you're in that space, not an apprenticeship world, when you're in the space of an internship, there's a 7-factor test. Our courts love to make things as challenging to navigate as possible sometimes. But the ultimate question is, who is really the primary beneficiary of the relationship of the internship? Is it the employer or is it the intern? Is it the student? And that then goes to determine whether or not employment law as we know it, and FLSA, and a number of the other key items that are known throughout employment law to be critical for determining someone's rights, whether those are triggered. So that's the other end of the apprenticeship side. Jake described it as employment law plus. When you're in internship world, it's more about first determining is the primary beneficiary the employer or the intern, and then determining from there what type of rights apply.
Okay. One of the questions that I have is how have recent changes in labor laws affected the apprenticeship landscape, particularly in terms of compliance?
Yeah, there have been a number of changes, and some of them are federal and some of them are state. When Jake and I were preparing for this and starting to talk through what we thought was most interesting, one that I found to be particularly interesting is particularly within the equal employment opportunity space for apprenticeships. The language from the federal law and regulations codifies some changes that our courts are sort of moving along in general employment law as far as protected classes. In the language itself of equal opportunity for apprenticeships prohibits the discrimination explicitly on the basis of things like gender identity and sexual orientation, which our federal employment law doesn't actually say those things. It says on the basis of sex, and we've had some court cases to interpret that and apply it more explicitly. But that's one significant change, and one thing where apprenticeship law is actually a little more clear that those are protected classes for purposes of equal opportunity.
Interesting. Before we move on, I want to just check with Dr. Sun and see if we have any questions from participants.
We don't have any questions right now, but everything's moving along. It's what it looks like. Everybody, I can see people's activity, and they're very interested. So we can proceed, Tamika.
Okay. All right. So we'll move on to one of our next topics. This is very robust with our audience. Students' rights in apprenticeships. So one of the questions, what are the key legal protections for student apprentices regarding working conditions, wages, and safety?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I'm glad you asked it actually. So again, I'll go back to this. Kind of goes back to the original question of internships versus apprenticeships, and I think this highlights another significant difference. The general default rule in most states is that if you are an employee, you are employed at will. And what that means is that you can quit at any time for any reason, and the employer can terminate you at any time for any reason, so long as it is not discriminatory or retaliatory. And Mike kind of touched on that with, the more expanded protected class. So that's one example, would be the expansion of the protections offered for different protected class: race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, gender, disability, et cetera. So that's one of the areas. The other area, though, is that taking that kind of at-will concept further, the inverse to that would be an employee who has a written employment agreement. And in a written employment agreement, you may, as the employer, offer them a certain guaranteed period of employment for 1 year or 2 years, et cetera. And at that point, it's both an employment relationship as well as a contractual relationship. And what that means is, if I want to end this employment relationship, I also need to understand how to end that contract. I have to be able to terminate that contract. And what you see is an apprenticeship agreement between the apprentice and the applicable employer. And sometimes there are, the sponsors, if it's a labor union or if it's a certification accreditation authority, they will have additional kind of stipulations about what needs to go in that contract. But, what you typically see is you're going to employ this apprentice for a period of time, and there's kind of more narrow parameters under which you may terminate that apprenticeship, because the idea is this apprentice is coming to you willing and able to work. They're following through with this program. It's highly regulated. Kind of pulling the rug out from under them without a pretty good reason to do so would seem fundamentally unfair. So I'd say one of the biggest things is, when you talk about apprenticeships, you're really in the world of that kind of employment law contract. And you have to read the contract. That is both the responsibility of the employer as well as the right and responsibility of the apprentice, is to understand the terms of that relationship. Whereas with an internship, you walk in day one, the default rules may be really, really vague and kind of employer favorable in some instances. That is not the same case with the student rights and responsibilities by any stretch of the imagination. And so you do have more of those. You also need to understand the kind of progressive nature of the pay scale, right? So the idea is that as you progress through, if you're in a 3-year program, every time that you hit whatever that defined milestone is, your pay should be increasing. You should also understand when you get paid for certain activities and when you may not necessarily get paid for certain activities. So that's not so clear with a regular internship or a regular employee. There may be circumstances where, if that employee has training for the job, but it's not necessarily required by the employer, they may not necessarily, under wage and hour law, have to be paid for that. Under the apprenticeship program, the apprentice's hours, which we can get to in a moment, the minimum of 144, additional training hours, those are typically paid. And in fact, you got to understand how much they're paid and what progressive rate they're paid at, and every year how much you have to do it. So kind of to summarize student rights, read the contract. You have a lot more rights under that contract. You also have some responsibilities under the contract. But also understand the pay structure and the scale, because it's not just as simple as, okay, so long as I'm paying minimum wage or so long as I'm receiving minimum wage. There's also rules against things like overtime. I think your specific question was more to health and safety. There are absolutely requirements for safety training for the apprentice that you may not necessarily have under general OSHA law or under general employment law. These regulations require the employer to go further to understand the training. And in particular, that the impetus of that really is understanding the nature of these apprenticeships. They're typically highly skilled hands-on positions that are involving things like, and not all the time, but I mean, if you imagine an electrical worker or somebody, safety is critical to that, because it's unlike my job, right? Here behind a desk, maybe I'll stub my toe walking out the door, and that's not fun, but I'm also not dealing with live voltage wires or something like that, or medical machinery that something could malfunction and go wrong. So safety becomes a paramount and critical requirement that you have to immediately start training the apprentice on.
Someone asked the question of how can you address the apprenticeship format for youth apprenticeships? So youth apprenticeships, while they're usually from 16 to 24 is what we technically say, the question really relates to 16-year-olds or minors. How do we address that?
Oh yeah, this is a good one as well. And from the student rights perspective, you're going to have kind of the same level of rights, right? You're still going to have all of the typical protections. I'd say that this is where the employer side lawyer in me kind of comes out, is you have a lot more considerations than the employer side, right? So depending on your applicable state laws, I would want to be looking into at what age is that minor allowed to drive? At what age is that minor allowed to enter into a contract? At what age, do you need their parent consent for things like that? Are they able to show up at certain times? Teachers, the federal government obviously has regulations on minors working and the hours that they can work and things like that. Your state may go further than that. So whereas the federal law will set the floor, your state may go a little further than that. So always understanding exactly where the services are going to be rendered is important too, particularly with probably most of us, if not all of us on this call, where we live in the tri-state area. So you could be an employer in Northern Kentucky and sending somebody to Ohio or to Indiana. And so you really have to understand the laws of each state in which they're performing as well.
Dr. Kamras, did you have anything to follow up?
On the student rights and apprenticeships, just kind of two other items I wanted to touch on that are unique in apprenticeships as far as student rights that may not exist in kind of internship land. One is that your program kind of be registered and approved by whoever it is in that state that is charged with doing that. It's about half and half. About half the states have the federal government that does this, and half the states have their own state agency that meets the federal regulations, and they're charged with kind of registering these apprenticeships. But the truth is, kind of any old employer could say, hey, we have an internship, post an internship, and that may not necessarily mean anything, right? There's no some government registration that's kind of reviewed it and approved it and determined it's met all of the requirements. And in apprenticeships, that is required. So it is kind of a heightened right of someone who is in an apprenticeship to be in a position of a program that's really been reviewed and studied and determined by the proper accrediting group that it meets all of the requirements to be a registered apprenticeship. And the other item that I just wanted to mention is apprentices have a right to real access from someone who is kind of well skilled in that craft. The law often refers to it as a journeyman. I don't love that term, but to have a hallmark, a benchmark of an apprenticeship, and one of the rights that students do enjoy is to really get that specific training from someone who is well versed in that craft. And in internships, sometimes that happens, and you the kind of like running joke about internships sometimes is, are you the person that's going and getting the gopher to get the coffee, that type of stuff. And unfortunately, probably for some students who are interns, that's the case. But in apprenticeships, a real key component of it is to have that direct contact, training, supervision from someone who is well skilled in that craft.
One question that comes to mind for me, to expand on the student rights and apprenticeships, what are the separation rights that they have, or what kind of separation benefits are they privy to? Like if the apprenticeship has to end early, are these students allowed any kind of maybe unemployment insurance, or since there is a work contract, there's an employment contract?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's highly dependent on the contract itself. Sometimes what you will see, so I'll kind of start a little sub question and work the way up. Sometimes what you will see in contracts for employment is, you have to give me, the employer, you have to give me 2 weeks notice or 4 weeks notice or whatever. And the truth is either by practicality or by legality, that's not really going to be enforceable. The truth is, if you want out as an apprentice, you're going to get out of the contract, right? Nobody can force you to work somewhere you don't want to work. But if, you know, the inverse is true, if it's more difficult on the employer side to get out. So when I talked about those more narrow parameters, which are sort of like for-cause termination provisions, if you've ever dealt with a termed employment agreement, usually those are things like gross insubordination, you know, failing to show up to work, excessive absenteeism. Maybe there are performance metrics that you know you're just not meeting. In any of those cases, you know, what is the right and the responsibility of the employer? Pay attention to those, make sure that you're actually following through with those. And some of this is where legal and practicality mix, and frankly, just humanity mix. Be proactive. I think that's my biggest recommendation to employers, and I say it all the time, is just be proactive whenever you have somebody that you believe that it's just not working out. Figure out the why behind it first before going to the end goal of, okay, it's not working out, I want to get rid of you. There's any number in any combination of factors that could lead to that. And you know, you start with kind of having an open and frank conversation with the employee in a way that's not demoralizing to figure out, if you can, what's the root cause of that? You know, sometimes it is just the employee's not showing up, and you're going to part ways, and that's fine. Document it, do all the things you would normally do. But sometimes it's a little more subtle than that. Sometimes it's, well, but look, the mentor that I've been assigned to doesn't show up on time, or the mentor that I'm assigned to says that's not a big deal, or they're not teaching me things very well. They may be very good at their job, but they're not a very good mentor. They're not walking me through the steps to get from A to Z so that I understand when it's my turn to do that, or, you know, they admonish me too roughly. So maybe mixing up the mentor, right, is a good path for that. But before you make the determination on separation, figure out the kind of why behind it. And that's the soft factor. And that also helps you legally, by the way, because if you as an employer can demonstrate that, look, I really did do what the contract required and more, and I documented that, and it still didn't work out, that's better for everybody. The employee got a fair shot at it, and the employer kind of both covered their bases, but also gave that fair shot to the apprentice.
Thank you.
And I'll add also, just kind of on the topic of why people leave work sometimes. Apprentices do enjoy the same kind of labor law protections that other folks do on things that can happen in life that can cause, you know, maybe a need for a pause on work or something like that. For example, FMLA, family medical leave, like those laws apply to apprentices just as they do to other employees. Actually, another thing in the equal employment opportunity language of apprentices is it explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of pregnancy. So some of the things in life that can happen that can cause maybe a need for a pause on work, apprentices as employees do enjoy the same rights, and maybe even a little more than kind of any old employee out in a workplace that's regulated by federal law.
Thank you. That also addresses that question that we just had. That was a kind of a review of that question, because I'm sure we have employers in here that's one of their concerns. You know, what do we do? And that's never the goal, is to have to separate. But in case of, what would our responsibilities be? So this gives us a great segue into our next section. Dr. Sun, did we have any questions before we move forward?
Yeah, the question that someone raised was, can a journeyman be considered an apprenticeship? Yeah, it's kind of a technical question, so it's kind of a tough question, actually, because technically the answer is yes and sometimes, and no and other times. And so, but basically we generally say it is not, it's more of the stage after an apprenticeship. But there are some evidence to show that you could actually sometimes call it part of the apprenticeship. So it depends on how it's written and the job is written. It depends also on the role of the position. So some positions are considered, we call them journeyman positions, but they're just stepping stone positions, because we are using the term journey person in a broad way, and sometimes in certain roles, such as in IT, in healthcare, we still use the term sometimes, but they're not. They're more akin to an apprenticeship or just a traditional job placement. So it was a technical term. Sorry.
Thank you. All right. So to segue into our next topic, it would be employer responsibilities. So now we'll discuss the legal obligations and best practices for providing apprentices with meaningful and compliant learning experiences. One of my questions is, what are the core legal responsibilities for employers? We kind of touched on this a little bit during the students' responsibilities, but we want to focus specifically on like hiring and making sure they can ensure compliance with both federal and state laws.
Sure. Again, I can kick it off, and Micah, you're welcome to interject at any time. I go back to employment law plus, right? So every responsibility and obligation you have as an employer to a typical employee, you are also going to have to the apprentice. Plus, you are going to have all of the federal regulations and things like that that we are talking about. So, as a baseline from employment law, from hiring, non-discrimination, right? Even in the hiring process. Ensuring that factors like an applicant's, all of the protected class, race, religion, national origin, ethnicity, all of those things that we talk about that are federally protected and in some cases also protected at the state level, that is not factoring into your decision of employment, whether to hire or not to hire. And there's also questions that you want to make sure that you're understanding the way to interview so that you're not asking questions that, even if not facially discriminatory, may have some type of an impact on an individual or individuals of those protected class, intentionally or unintentionally, right? So one thing is, go over it with an independent third party, preferably with an attorney, but go over your hiring practices for that kind of implicit bias that you may not be recognizing, right? Things that may have an impact. Asking questions, are you pregnant or planning to become pregnant? Obviously, right? That is a very, very no question to ask. But sometimes you'll see variations of that which do not intend to get to that, but things like, do you plan on taking time off, right? In the future. So those types of questions are important, and also paying attention to your local regulations, city type ordinances that are passed on things like ban the box, and whether or not you can ask people about criminal records before or after you've done the interview. So paying attention to all that is applicable to any employee, not just apprentices. In the apprenticeship position, I think being incredibly, or in that process, being incredibly clear with the apprentice about the expectations of both what is expected from the student and the employer. Here's what the path looks like, right? Don't hide the ball on it. Allow them to ask questions, answer their questions, and tell them this is what it looks like. And this is what the path looks like, and here's our responsibilities and your responsibilities, so that there's no kind of mismanaged expectations should you choose to hire that individual. When you hire that individual, you have a certain period of time to fill out additional paperwork. So you've got the paperwork of a typical employee, onboarding paperwork, W-9s and things like that, getting their W-4s or W-9s. In addition to that, you are also going to want to fill out the required paperwork from the Department of Labor, the Office of Apprenticeship. You have a certain period of time to get that in. Get it in early while it's fresh in your mind. So once you actually onboard somebody, get it in and just do the paperwork, right? Don't miss the paperwork if you're on the employer side. And then finally, the one thing that I'll say is I think the onboarding process in the beginning has probably the most indication of success or failure of any employee, frankly, not just of an apprenticeship, but more so with apprentices. And by that, I mean trying to match personality types as much as possible with the right mentor, somebody understanding who the mentors are that can be the most helpful to this individual and their particular wants and needs and goals. And making them feel as quickly as possible like they are a part of the team, like they're not the intern that fetches the coffee, but rather like we are training you with the hopes that you will be able to do this job one day. And while you may not be super helpful day one or day two, eventually you are going to be helpful, and eventually you are going to be incredibly valuable to this team, and we respect that and understand that. And so we want your experience here. There's a reason why we're paying you for this, right? And it's not just because we're required to. We're paying you for this because we want you here. We respect your time, and eventually you are going to start becoming very, very valuable.
Yeah, one other just item I'll add here that it's different for kind of regular old employers is, in addition to having, all the federal laws that you have to comply with as a employer and all the state and local laws, you also have to get registered by the state apprenticeship agency. You have to commit to doing a certain number of things, and you must keep doing those, right? It's it's not enough to just get registered and say, yes, we satisfied all the requirements and then move on. It is an ongoing responsibility. And Jake said, you got to make sure you get the paperwork in, and that's correct. And then you actually have to do what the paperwork says you would do. And so it's another kind of different responsibility for an employer, and just kind of a normal employment arrangement is that ongoing compliance with the state agency to continue to do the things that you said you'd do that help you get your program registered in the first place.
Great. There's another question, but before I ask that question, I'll say to Jake that I fetch coffee as well as a full professor, so it's not just the apprentices.
I did it. Everybody's done it.
So in any case, the question that was posed was, and you kind of addressed some of these, but if you think about sort of the common pitfalls, legal pitfalls that employers face when managing apprenticeship programs, and you kind of address how you can avoid them, but maybe you can actually instead, maybe I'm going to, since you did cover most of it, is if you could just maybe modify the question by saying, like, what are some things that you've seen that you're like, wow, I can't believe that happened? Is there, like, these are things that we should look for and avoid them? I mean, one of them was the questioning. I think that was a good one, but maybe there's some other things that you can give us some examples of.
Other than the paperwork, I would tell you that Micah kind of touched on this, but not just saying, here's a mentor, go off and do, and then trusting that the mentor is watching over the program. So assigning somebody or some group of people to actually monitor the program itself and monitor individuals' progress through that program is really important. So, out of kind of the big three options that you have with a time-based program, a performance-based program, or a hybrid-based program, particularly on time-based programs, it's really easy to say, oh, you're here for 3 years, and then suddenly find out that you didn't do all of the required trainings. You didn't do all, you weren't meeting your hours. You're not able to perform the required tests. On the performance metrics, being very clear up front with the individual what those performance metrics are going to be, when they have to meet those metrics, and the best way to meet those metrics. And if you see somebody early on that is lagging behind in the metrics, not taking the affirmative step of saying, how can we help you to get where you need to be? And instead of just kind of letting somebody flail out on their own. So failing to pay attention to the program and just assuming that I've got a program, I'm done, or they're going to follow it and it's self-study is not enough. And that's where the pitfalls come. That's where the mismanaged expectations come. That's where folks then start to say, you, employer, did not do your responsibility in this relationship.
That's great. We have another question also is with at-will employment, what resources, for example, legal or anything free, are available for the employee, not just the employer?
SHRM.
Yeah, at least. And at least on the employee side, there are a lot of places you can go for help when there are issues that don't necessarily require spending money or hiring a lawyer, particularly like on the discrimination side. There are state agencies in a lot of states, federal EEOC. There are, if you're experiencing discrimination, you certainly have a right to obtain a lawyer, and when you are in the position to do that, that's wonderful. But those agencies are set up in a way where you can bring a complaint of discrimination forward with no resources at all. They have people help you kind of fill out the forms. They investigate them on their dime. It's not, having to prosecute a lawsuit or anything of that nature. So that is one, with the understanding that there's a power imbalance sometime with resources between employer and employee. That is one thing that the government does a really nice job of providing a resource for employees to, bring something forward and have the government put its resources toward investigating and sometimes litigating on behalf of an employee.
And I would add, depending on your comfort level and depending on what you're asking about, first line is mentor. Who's your mentor? And so if it's a simple question about your rights, hey, are we allowed to take time off? Am I allowed to have PTO? What about this? What about that? Sometimes just having friendly conversations with your mentor, it's a good way to establish rapport with that mentor, show deference to that mentor. Most people are more than happy to help you with general employment level questions. If it rises to the level of what are my rights relative to the employer, and you don't think that it's serious enough for like an EEOC complaint or something like that, but you are concerned about conduct, you're concerned about your mentor, you're concerned about your mentor's boss, whoever it is, every employer should have some form of human resources, some type of reporting line that can explain both your rights and responsibilities, but also can hear out things, and maybe there is a process in place at that employer to handle those issues. If you're looking for general trainings, right, just general information, and you want to find out more about rights and responsibilities, I have no ownership stake in this, so this is a plug for a company I have no affiliation with, but SHRM, SHRM, is the Society for Human Resources Management Professionals. A lot of the stuff that they put out, white papers and things like that, are really fantastic, and can give you pretty close to, you know, an employment lawyer level experience pretty quickly if you read up on that, and just kind of understanding at a 30,000-foot overview things like, you know, discrimination, retaliation, PTO, timeline accruals. That's really important. And then finally, I'd say, in terms of self-study or understanding rights and responsibility, there really is there's no substitute for understanding your own applicable documentation. So start by reading your contract. Always read your contract. Employer and student, read the contract, because that will answer a lot of those questions. But then if you have an employee manual or employee policies or a handbook or something like that, read those as well.
All right, I'll throw it back to our SHRM certified Tamika Shelton.
Thank you. So this kind of moves us into our last segment here. We have been rolling, but plenty of great information. I want to thank you guys. I've got a lot of notes here. I'm sure our participants do too. Our last section would be employee perspectives in apprenticeship. This just kind of talks about how they see the apprenticeship. What is their perspective of the apprenticeship? So one of the questions we have, how can employees effectively balance their roles in both workers and learners while participating in an apprenticeship program? How could they balance those two roles as a worker and a learner?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think anyone involved in kind of the management, supervision, and training of people, that's part of their day-to-day life, right? They are both responsible for an output at work and also responsible for developing others and helping them help produce an output and help them to grow. So, you know, there are some like contractual requirements and certain hours that must be spent on different things. And that's a kind of more technical answer to your question, I think. But from a broader perspective, I think a lot of folks that are involved in the, you know, workforce development training, the bringing in new folks and helping them get greater skills, that is a never-ending part of the work journey, right? An element of most roles. But I think getting to, no matter where you are in your career, whether you're an apprentice or you're, you know, senior management at the company, focusing on learning new things and getting better, while also continuing to do what is expected of you is a part of the job.
Yeah. Professional responsibility, I think, is a term me and Danica learned earlier. It's your professional responsibility to continue your learning. So that applies to apprentice as well. So within this section, another question that we had was, what are the legal rights and protections that employees have when they engage in an apprenticeship within their current workplace? So they're already employed. As an employee, the employee starts an apprenticeship program, they join the apprenticeship program. What does that look like?
I'm going to go back.
You've entered the plus territory, so that's the employment law plus. So everything and then a little bit. Then you now have a contract, and we're back into the same realm as what we talked about at the beginning of the presentation.
Oh, okay. So since they're already an employee, do they keep the same protections, being that excuse me, the apprenticeship protections are more defined, or would they fall under those apprenticeship protections?
You get the added benefit of the apprenticeship protections in that case,
Okay.
because you are presumably in that case, you'd be entering into an apprenticeship agreement with the employer. And so now, to what extent the employer considers things like PTO accrual or years of service or seniority, et cetera, that's kind of case dependent. Certainly good questions to ask, but in terms of, you know, legal protections and things of that sort, you've entered the territory now of an apprentice. Okay,
that was another one of my questions, and I'm sorry, it's kind kind of related to our last topic of employer responsibilities. What about benefits? Is that contractual as well? Or are there certain legal responsibilities that employers have to provide benefits to the apprentices?
There are some broad strokes about what you have to offer, successive pay escalation, things like that. But in terms of specific benefits, again, that's going to be, I think, case by case dependent on your particular contract.
Okay, I'm sure that helps.
And there are federal laws that on certain benefits like healthcare, different things that you'd fall into if your company is required to offer those types of benefits. And there are also certain laws that prohibit you from having different benefits for different types of employees, depending on, so for example, a 401k, if you have a 401k program, those types of things often they have to be made available to all employees if it's something that you make available. So those types of rights the employer, the apprentice would have.
Okay, that's great to know. How can employees address conflicts between their apprenticeship obligations and their existing job responsibilities? So this would be maybe an incumbent worker that enters into an apprenticeship.
Well, I think the very first thing goes back to, and I know I harp on this, although I think the world would be a better place if everybody would listen to it. It's communication up front, right? Managing expectations and understanding. Okay, I've got, assuming you're kind of acting in a dual role here. You've got your regular job duties. You're also following an apprenticeship program. Being very clear about the demands of that apprenticeship program and the essential functions of your job and what you were expected to perform. And how can I, as the apprentice, manage those expectations? What I would recommend is that you talk with somebody who's been through that program, and preferably you talk with somebody, get a good sample of that, somebody who's in your position, somebody who's running that kind of dual role in the day in and day out. Particularly somebody, if you can find it, who has a similar life experience or is at the same place in life as you. If you are. If you have kids, or if you have, you're taking care of an ailing family member, as close to those kind of external obligations as well, because that really does come into it. Somebody who has the ability to do a whole bunch of things because they have more time than others is probably not somebody that would give you a good read on just how taxing it is on their life. But talking with as many people as possible, understanding that, being very clear with whoever it is or whichever people are kind of monitoring, as they should be, that apprenticeship program, to be clear about the expectations in each role. And you can set those expectations. If you can, what you should do is sit down with your employer, some representative there, and say, okay, I'm doing both of these things. There are limits on how much I'm allowed to work, frankly. But there's also limits on how much I can work and what I can do in each of these roles. I am probably more regimented under the apprenticeship contract because I have to do things like the certain number of hours of education, and I have to, learn to do this task for so many hours and that task for so many hours. So there's things I have to do there. Am I able to get dual credit for that? To what extent, what are my respective obligations, and how do we sort this out? Don't wait until you're in the program and struggling to then ask that question. Set the expectation in advance, talk with people, and understand kind of what your obligations are.
These types of conflicts aren't necessarily, different than other types of workplace conflicts of people being pulled in multiple directions and having lots of responsibilities to each other. And I think just kind of, working through the conflict resolution when that pops up in the workplace and having someone that can help resolve these when they pop up. There are protections against legal protections against harassment and bullying and those types of things if that's coming to be a result of the conflict. So in this, I think it's not that different than in non-apprenticeship positions, just kind of different conflicts that can arise and the fairness of how to work to resolve conflicts among employees to move the enterprise forward.
Thank you. That's great advice. Do we have a question, Dr. Sun?
We do have a question. This one's a question for me. So just because I think we have some audiences here, so audience members who are working at universities and colleges, and they probably want to know, hey, can I get sued for something that goes wrong? Let's say, for instance, the apprentice is affiliated is a student at the college. is doing has an apprenticeship placement at X company, and they get injured on the job. And everybody who knows me on this panel knows that I get injured very easily, just on my own accord.
Yeah, yeah.
So my answer to every "can I get sued for blank" is yes. You can get sued for anything, and unfortunately, there are some in our industry who that's kind of the go-to move of sue as many different people as you can find and name them. And in an instance like this, where you can say, sure, the university directed the apprentice to that. Ultimately, the real questions are: one, is there insurance available? And two, do I have a real risk of liability or responsibility for like an injury on the job from someone who got placed in apprenticeship through my university? I'm actually not sure of the insurance question, and that would be kind of place by place dependent, but probably. And on the responsibility standpoint, it is hard to imagine the type of thing that could occur between an apprentice in a workplace where the university that kind of has a student going there or helped get them to that program is truly responsible for it, or where a trier of fact, a judge or a jury, would determine that it actually was the university that has that responsibility there. So is there a real risk of getting sued? Yes, certainly. Too much of one for what the world should be if I were in charge of it. Is there a high degree of likelihood of being found responsible or having an uninsurable loss? I don't think so.
Yeah, and I, as an outside counsel to a university, one of the kind of analogous scenarios that I could imagine, which is not necessarily in the apprenticeship realm, but if you're a university that has like a nursing program, and that nurse is at a local hospital doing a clinical or a practice, so I always would ask then, what is the claim, first of all? Like, what happened if there's a student of a university who goes to employer X, and while at employer X falls and breaks their leg because there was water on the floor that nobody picked up? Premises liability. In that case, I'm pointing the finger at the owner of the property. Obviously, anybody can sue for anything, but I'm pointing the finger at the owner of the property, and there are all risks of property insurance to cover that. If they injure themselves on the job and the performance of their work, the employment relationship, it's for whose benefit were they working, right? Was it within the scope of their employment? If they get injured within the scope of their employment, the employer has a legal obligation, respondeat superior, vicarious liability, all fancy ways of saying, if you're an employee, you're doing something on behalf of your employer, the employer has a duty to kind of hold you harmless for that. Obviously, that doesn't extend to things like, torts, if you were to go out and intentionally harm somebody or commit a crime. But if you're in good faith performing your operations and you're doing that on behalf of your employer, generally the employer is going to have the legal liability for that, which is why the employer should have really good insurance in place: commercial general liability insurance, employment law type insurance, et cetera. They should also have workers' compensation insurance in place for the employee. I'd say the third and final kind of interesting scenario that I often see in questions that I get a lot in similar contexts is, what if somebody's driving their own car, right? And they get hurt in the car? Whose insurance kicks in? Can I make them get their own insurance, et cetera? What if they're going from the university to the employer and they get hurt on the way there? It's a really interesting legal question. Again, is that basically defined as, are they moving from their is it defined as commute, right? So is it the same commute as if they were going from their home to the workplace? And if they're going from their home to the workplace, or from college to the workplace, or from McDonald's to the workplace, and they get injured, that's not considered on-the-job time. That's not considered personal time. And so that generally would fall under the student's liability insurance, their auto liability insurance, because that's on them. The second that they clock in at work, if they are doing something for the benefit of the employer, again, they're within the scope of employment. And so if that student gets injured, even if they make a claim to their own personal auto liability insurance carrier, that carrier is then going to do something we call subrogate the claim, saying, look, I'm not the one left holding the bag for this. This is going to be on your employer. And once again, your employer is going to have insurance. So maybe tying this back to employer responsibilities, the same responsibility that you would have for employees. Make sure you have good insurance in place that covers all of your employees in all these different scenarios.
All right, I'll throw it back to Tamika, who I think is closing up.
Yes, I just have one last question for you. So just because we have a varied audience here, could you give us some of the benefits that are gained from participating in an apprenticeship program as an employee, and how can they leverage those benefits for future career advancement?
Yeah, well, the one benefit obviously is the end goal, which is to say, hey, I made it through this program and I have the following requisite skills. And that's really, not only is that employable day one, but that's transferable, right? If you have completed an apprenticeship as a somebody in the healthcare industry, as a dental assistant, as an electrician, you don't necessarily have to go to one employer, you can go to many employers, but at least what that signifies to employers and the benefit of having a regimented system through the federal government like this, a registered apprenticeship program, is that means something. And it comes with all of the things that people can recognize and say, you went through that program, therefore you must have the requisite skills for this. An internship is not necessarily the same thing. If I tell you that I interned at a law firm, during law school, that doesn't mean I possess the skills to go practice law. In fact, I don't know what that means, right? It could mean anything from, again, we joke about it, but I'm really good at fetching coffee or moving furniture or whatever. So that doesn't have the same symbolic effect of saying I have the requisite skills. So that's number one. And number two is, getting paid while learning is truly a beautiful thing. I mean, it is, I think it's symbolic of saying to an employee that you should be a lifelong learner and that you shouldn't put your life on hold to learn this job and to do it. And that, particularly with the escalating pay, the progressive pay that is built into these contracts, it allows people who maybe wouldn't be able to go out and take a job to do this apprenticeship program. And I'm looking particularly at non-traditional, although I'm not a fan of that word, but non-traditional folks who say, look, I'm in one job right now, and I'd really like to do something else, but I can't take that big of a pay cut, or I certainly can't work as an intern for no pay in some cases, right? Depending on what you're doing. And I need to be able to earn while I learn. And I think that this gives folks that opportunity. And then finally, a third benefit that I would say is the way that this synergizes with colleges and what you talked about at the beginning of this, where, colleges are now getting in and offering courses and partnering with the community. I think that it allows folks a good alternative to college. For many different reasons, college is not necessarily everybody's route, and it doesn't have to be. And I think that by exposing the good that apprenticeships offer, it does allow people that alternative route that say, look, maybe I don't want to go get a traditional 4-year degree, but I'd really like to go do X, Y, and Z, and I can start learning immediately. And if college is not your path for whatever reason, apprenticeships offer you in most cases, a really lucrative career. These lead to very, very real salaries, sometimes faster than a college degree. And so it's jobs that are in high demand and needed. So it's good for the society, it's good for the employer, and it's good for the employee.
Thank you. Dr. Kamras, I don't know if you were, I think you got disconnected for a second, but the question
I did for a sec.
Yeah, did you hear the question, or I can repeat it? What long-term
Yeah,
benefits?
the benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the certification that you have become an expert in this craft, and like we talked about at the beginning, some of these are trades that are hundreds and hundreds or many more years than that old, and to be able to have that as a marker, a certification, wherever you go forward in your career from there, that's something that means something out in the workplace and in employment and in future employment opportunities. And then Jake mentioned all the financial benefits too unfortunately, our system doesn't always allow for a lot of opportunities to earn an income while you're learning and being trained. In fact, it often requires a lot of money to do that. And to be able to have that part of your career development is a critical thing for a lot of folks.
Thank you. Well, we are at the end of our presentation today. We gained a lot from you all. Thank you for showing up and inviting us into your insight. Dr. Sun, just want to check if we have any last questions.
We have no more questions.
Okay. Well, Dr. Comras and Mr. Purcell, we appreciate you being here. And hopefully we can do this again. I'm sure there are many things that we can expand on. I know I have some more questions, but I'll email you. I want to thank everybody for showing up today. And thank you to Annika and Danica for giving us an overview of MAPS. All right. So thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.